The first time my neighbor invited me into his kitchen, it didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like relief. I had just moved into the building, still surrounded by half unpacked boxes and the quiet that follows a major life change. We had exchanged polite greetings before, the kind that barely scratch the surface of who someone is. That evening, he knocked gently and said he had made too much food and didn't want it to go to waste. His voice was calm, unassuming. I said yes without thinking much about it. Asterisk, his kitchen was warm in a way mine wasn't yet. Not because of decorations or space, but because of intention. Everything had a purpose. As we ate, he talked about simple things, work, the neighborhood, how long he had lived here. He listened carefully when I spoke, not interrupting, not rushing me. It felt rare. I remember thinking how strange it was to feel understood by someone I barely knew. Asterisk, that first meal turned into another a few days later, then another the following week. There was no pressure, no expectations spoken out loud. Just food, conversation, and time that passed quickly without effort. He shared stories about leaving his home country, about starting over with nothing but determination and patience. There was no bitterness in his words, only honesty. I admired that. I admired him. Asterisk, slowly, the conversation shifted. We moved from small talk to memories. He spoke about loneliness in a way that didn't ask for pity, only acknowledgement. I spoke about my past relationship, the one that had taught me how silence can be louder than arguments. I hadn't planned to share that much, but something about the quiet between his words made it easy, safe. Asterisk, the kitchen became our meeting place, not because we decided it, but because it felt natural. It was neutral ground, a place where nothing bad had happened yet. We didn't talk every day, but when we did, it felt intentional. Like we were choosing the moment instead of killing time. I began to look forward to those evenings more than I wanted to admit. Asterisk, he never crossed boundaries. That was part of what made me trust him. No inappropriate comments. No lingering looks. Just presence. When I was tired, he noticed. When I was quiet, he didn't push. That kind of awareness can feel like care, especially when you've been starved of it. I told myself I was lucky to have found a neighbor who felt more like a friend. Asterisk, there were moments. Those small ones that didn't fully settle. He asked questions that felt deeper than the situation required. He remembered details I had forgotten sharing. At the time, I saw it as attentiveness. Now, I wonder if it was something else. But back then, I brushed those thoughts aside. Trust, once offered, tends to silence doubt. Asterisk, one night, he cooked a dish that reminded him of home. He explained each ingredient not as a lesson, but as a memory. He talked about his mother, about how food was how love was shown in his family. I felt honored to be sitting there, eating something that carried so much meaning. It felt intimate, even without romance. Emotional intimacy has a way of sneaking up on you like that. Asterisk, I noticed how easily I spoke around him, how my guard lowered without effort. I didn't rehearse my words or censor my thoughts. I didn't feel like I had to perform. That was new for me. Comfort can be intoxicating when you've lived too long on edge. I didn't realize how much I needed it until it was there. Asterisk, he once said that kitchens reveal who people really are. That when someone invites you into that space, they're trusting you with more than just a meal. I believed him. I believed that invitation meant something permanent, something sincere. I didn't know then that spaces can lie. Just like people can dot asterisk, by the time I recognized how much those moments mattered to me, the bond was already formed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, built on shared silence and carefully chosen words. I thought that kind of connection was unbreakable. I thought I had finally found a place where I could rest without looking over my shoulder, Asterisk, I didn't know that trust doesn't always shatter loudly. Sometimes it dissolves slowly, starting from the very place where it was first offered. Asterisk, 2/8. 12:46 a.m. Shahir Kolachi. What started as comfort gradually became something more complicated. I didn't notice the shift at first because it didn't announce itself. There was no confession, no defining moment, just a growing sense that his presence mattered more than it should. I began adjusting my schedule without realizing it, making sure I was home on evenings we usually talked. When days passed without hearing from him, I felt the absence in a way that surprised me. Asterisk, our conversations grew heavier, not in a burdensome way, but in depth. He spoke about the pressure of always being strong, of never showing uncertainty because people mistake it for weakness. He said he was tired of being misunderstood. I listened, offering empathy, believing that being there was enough. In return, he encouraged me to speak honestly, to stop minimizing my feelings. He made it sound like growth, like healing. Asterisk, the kitchen stopped feeling like a neutral place and began to feel personal. It held our routines, our pauses, our unspoken understanding. Sometimes we sat without talking at all, sharing food in silence. Those moments felt intimate in a way words couldn't capture. Silence can bond people faster than conversation if both are willing to sit in it. Asterisk, he started sharing details about his past relationships. Carefully, selectively. He spoke about betrayal, about being taken for granted, about how trust once cost him everything. His voice never shook, but there was a restraint in it that made the stories feel real. I believed him completely. I told myself that someone who had been hurt so deeply wouldn't hurt someone else the same way. Asterisk. There was a sense of exclusivity that crept in quietly. He didn't demand it, but he suggested it. Comments about how most people were unreliable, how rare it was to find someone who truly listened, how distractions ruined genuine connections. When I mentioned spending time with friends, he smiled, but the warmth faded just slightly. I noticed it, then ignored it. I told myself I was reading too much into things. Asterisk, I began to rely on his perspective more than my own. When something bothered me, I waited to talk to him before reacting. His calm way of framing things made me feel steadier, more reasonable. I didn't see that I was slowly outsourcing my judgment. At the time, it felt like partnership, like mutual support. Asterisk. There were moments when his curiosity felt intense. He asked about my fears, my insecurities, the things I regretted. I answered because he had shared his. That felt fair, balanced. I didn't realize how carefully he remembered everything, storing it away like information instead of trust. I thought closeness meant transparency. I didn't question why he rarely spoke about his present, only his past. Asterisk, the idea of love surfaced without being named. It lived in gestures instead of words, in how he remembered my preferences, in how he checked in when I seemed distant, and how he framed our connection as rare. I didn't correct him. I didn't slow it down. Part of me was relieved to feel chosen without being chased. Asterisk, at some point, I noticed that I felt uneasy when I disappointed him. Not afraid, but concerned in a way that felt new. His approval had weight. If he seemed distant, I replayed our last conversation, wondering what I had done wrong. I told myself it was normal to care, that this was what emotional closeness looked like. Asterisk, he once said that love didn't need labels to be real, that naming things too early ruined them. I agreed, even though a part of me wanted clarity. I ignored that instinct because I didn't want to disrupt what felt stable. I thought patience was maturity. I didn't see how silence was working against me. Asterisk, the bond felt deep, but it wasn't equal. I was revealing more, leaning in further, adjusting more. He remained composed, grounded, just out of reach. I mistook that distance for depth. I believed I was moving towards something meaningful, something safe. Asterisk, I didn't realize that love, when it asks you to shrink quietly, isn't love at all. At the time, though, all I saw was connection, and I held on to it, unaware of how fragile it truly was. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, small enough to dismiss if I wanted to. A comment that didn't align with the story he had told before. A detail that shifted when I asked about it again. At first, I blamed my memory. I didn't want to believe I had misunderstood someone I trusted so completely. Doubt felt like betrayal, and I wasn't ready to turn it inward. Asterisk, one evening, I overheard a conversation by accident. I wasn't eavesdropping. I simply paused when I heard my name mentioned. The tone was casual, almost dismissive. He spoke about me as if I were an idea, not a person. Not cruelly, but strategically. That distinction hurt more than anger would have. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to pieces fall into place. Asterisk, what I learned unraveled weeks of meaning. The closeness I thought we shared wasn't unique. The trust I believed was mutual had been selective. He had been presenting different versions of himself depending on who was listening. What felt like vulnerability now looked rehearsed. What felt like patience now looked calculated. Asterisk, I confronted him, not with accusations, but with questions. I wanted an explanation that would restore what I thought we had. He didn't deny what I had heard. He didn't apologize either. He explained, calmly, logically. He said he never promised me anything. That he had been honest in his own way. That I had assumed more than he offered. Asterisk, his words were careful, chosen to avoid blame. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding, as emotional imbalance. He suggested that I had leaned in too far, too fast. Hearing that, something shifted inside me. I realized how thoroughly the responsibility was being redirected. The intimacy had been mutual, but the accountability was suddenly mine alone. Asterisk, I asked him why he shared so much, why he encouraged my openness if he didn't intend to protect it. He said connection didn't require obligation, that people should be free to take what they need from each other. The way he said it stripped the warmth from every memory we shared. I saw then how differently we had been participating. Asterisk, the kitchen felt unfamiliar, like a place that had been staged rather than lived in. The warmth I once felt there was gone, replaced by clarity that stung. I replayed conversations in my mind, noticing the moments where I had filled in the gaps with hope. I had trusted tone instead of consistency. I had mistaken attention for intention. Asterisk, what hurt most wasn't that he didn't feel the same way. It was realizing that he had known long before I did how unbalanced things were. He had let me believe in something he had already defined as temporary. That kind of knowledge creates an uneven playing field. And I had been standing on the wrong side of it. Asterisk, he told me he never meant to hurt me. I believe that, but intention didn't undo impact. He had benefited from my trust, my availability, my emotional labor. I had walked away confused, questioning my judgment. That wasn't accidental. Even if it wasn't malicious, it was still betrayal. Asterisk, I left without raising my voice. There was no dramatic exit, just a quiet understanding that staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. I felt embarrassed, not because I cared, but because I had ignored my own instincts for so long. Asterisk, in the days that followed, the silence was loud. I felt grief, not for him, but for the version of myself that believed safety could be borrowed without consequence. I understood then that betrayal doesn't always come from lies. Sometimes it comes from withheld truth, from letting someone believe alone. Asterisk, the invitation into that space had felt like trust. Now I knew it had been access. And once that distinction became clear, there was no way to unsee it after I stopped going over. The days felt uneven, Like I was relearning how to move without leaning on something familiar. I expected anger to come first, but it didn't. What surfaced instead was a quiet disappointment that settled into everything. Not just disappointment in him, but in myself for confusing consistency with commitment. That realization stayed with me longer than the hurt. Asterisk, I avoided replaying our conversations at first, afraid I would find more signs I had missed. Eventually, I allowed myself to look back without judgment. I saw how often I had adjusted my expectations to match his comfort, how I had accepted ambiguity as depth. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. Pain with context is easier to carry. Asterisk, I didn't confront him again. There was nothing left to clarify. He had been clear when it mattered most, and I finally believed him. Closure didn't come from another conversation. It came from recognizing that clarity doesn't always feel kind. Sometimes it feels abrupt, even cold. But it is still a form of respect, even when it arrives too late. Asterisk, the kitchen remained unchanged physically, but in my mind, it was no longer a place of refuge. It became a reminder that intimacy requires mutual care, not just shared space. I stopped romanticizing the idea of connection without accountability. I stopped telling myself that understanding someone meant accepting everything they offered. Even when it left me uncertain. Asterisk, there were moments when I missed the ease of our talks, the rhythm we had fallen into. But I learned to separate missing comfort from missing the person. Comfort can be recreated. Trust, once fractured, cannot. That distinction helped me move forward without nostalgia blurring the truth. Asterisk, I forgave him quietly, without informing him. Not because he asked for it, but because holding on to resentment felt like extending the connection longer than it deserved. Forgiveness for me was an act of reclaiming space. It didn't mean reopening the door. It meant closing it without bitterness. Asterisk, what stayed with me most was the lesson about boundaries. I realized that emotional openness is not a transaction. Sharing does not entitle someone to access, and listening does not guarantee safety. I learned to ask clearer questions, to notice when my needs were being postponed instead of met. Those skills didn't come gently, but they came honestly. Asterisk, I began rebuilding my routines, filling my time with things that didn't require validation. Friends noticed a shift. I was quieter at first, more observant, then steadier. The experience didn't harden me, but it did sharpen my awareness. I trusted again, just differently. Asterisk, I no longer equate calm with sincerity. I pay attention to follow through, to consistency over time. I understand now that people can be kind and still cause harm, intentional or not. That complexity doesn't excuse the damage, but it explains it. And understanding allows me to let go without carrying blame. Asterisk. The invitation into that space taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. That love without clarity is riskier than solitude. That betrayal doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it wears the face of familiarity and speaks softly enough to be mistaken for care. Asterisk, I walked away with less certainty about others, but more respect for myself. And that balance, I've learned, is worth protecting.